a little bit girl power. How little the parents cared about their children. It was never a reference to sex. Welcome back. I've mentioned before that this is the year that I wanted to get back into reading. Because I'm a slow reader, I'm not someone who can it's very rare for me to be able to just pick up a new book once I put one down. I have a part-time job and stuff, other commitments in my life. Depending on if I continue doing this channel, I don't know, I might do seasonal wrap-ups. So like spring wrap-up, summer wrap-up. It's always interesting talking about books with other people because then you get a fresh perspective on what you've been reading. And if you've read any of these books, would love to hear your thoughts. The books that I've been reading since January are Miss Austen by Jill Hornby, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, Blood in the Mist by, I'm not sure how to pronounce that last name, Hope Mirlees. I'm butchering that, I'm really sorry. The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, Reputation by Lex Croucher, Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes, and then I also read Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, as well as We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. And I'm not going to talk about Pachinko so much in this video, or We Were Liars, because I talk about them in my previous video, last week's vlog type video. I'm not sure what to call that, but we've had wonderful sunshine for like several weeks now. Like the humidity is insane. So if I look shiny, it is because yes, I am. So yeah, are you ready? Let's get into it. So the first book I read this year was Miss Austen by Jill Hornby, which is a book about Jane Austen's older sister Cassandra. It is her in her final years, looking back at her youth, at her relationship with her sister, also her own engagement, which ended tragically, and sort of manages to look at what it meant for women back then to be spinsters, to be unmarried. It was a very slow-paced book, incredibly well written. I was interested in reading it because last autumn, I think, another book by Jill Hornby was released called Godmersham Park, which, if you don't know, is a place where Jane lived for a time. And so Godmersham Park, I'm pretty sure, is from Jane's perspective. I believe it's at the time where she was proposed to and accepted, and then the next day goes back on her word and says, I can't get married. So anyway, yeah, I was interested in reading Godmersham Park and was unable to get a hold of it. So I thought, well, I'll read Jill Hornby's other works. I've been interested in Jane Austen since my teens. I feel like that's like a rite of passage for a lot of bookish women, young women who grow up interested in literature. Yeah, you read your Jane Austen, your Bronte, potentially some Virginia Woolf, and then you go on in life fully prepared for exactly everything that life has to throw at you. Having also seen Becoming Jane, I was interested in reading about Cassandra. Famously, she burned her and Jane's letters. So in the book, there's the thrill of her figuring out where the letters are and trying to hide them and burn them and read them. And as she's reading them, she is looking back at her youth. Yeah, I think that's all I can really say. It's very tragic. Somehow a little bit girl power. This older sister looking at her younger sister who is determined, so determined to write that she is giving up her own well-being. And it's real. It's based on real events. The language feels really of the time. It feels true to the era. It's just written by a very well-researched author. It really comes through in the writing. So if you're an Austen fan, I would recommend this. Like I said, it's slow-paced to the point where it can maybe be a bit boring if you're not in that headspace. You know how when you read classics sometimes you have to be in a certain headspace to get through the text, and occasionally this book would have that element. So next book I read was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I'm sure a lot of people have talked about, because that's how I found out about this book. I don't think I would have if it wasn't for, I think Lena Norms was the first one, and then I've seen a lot of other people. So I'm not going to go into that too much. It has one of the elements that I have mentioned that I love, which is unreliable narration. So it's about this person who lives in what sort of, in my mind, was like this massive palace, because it's described as having endless halls, and where at the top are clouds and at the bottom an ocean where the tide comes in and brings in stuff and takes things away. And so the main character has some kind of memory loss and is trying to figure out who they are, where they are, what is happening. And he doesn't record time, like we have no idea when this is happening either. So like he'll record time as the year the albatross came into the southwestern hall, which is really interesting. And so it has that element of unreliable narration that I personally, like I mentioned before in my previous video, I think I'm really intrigued by that. I really like reading those types of stories. And that said, I did think that the end was a bit, or like the resolution was a bit anticlimactic, because like you're trying to figure out where this is based on descriptions and stuff. You are trying to find the answer in our world. Yeah, basically, I don't want to give too many spoilers. I felt like there was some kind of dissonance, some kind of disconnect there. Still a very good book, and I would reread the first half of it purely as like a masterclass in unreliable narration. So the next book I read, which took the longest to read out of all of the books on the list, I think, is Blood in the Mist. It was interesting. This is a book, one of the, I think, first fantasy books written ever. I think it was published in 1928 or 29, I could be wrong. Anyway, it's from the 20s and it was written by a woman. Both of those things really intrigued me. But there was something, also, the reason I heard about this book was Christiane Jones has talked about it. She's a big fan of Neil Gaiman. I was interested in reading this one because he has said it is one of his favorite books. According to other fans of his, has influenced a lot of his work. So I was interested in that. So it's about human city that is sort of on the border to fairyland. There has been a ban on any interaction with fairyland, and there's like fairy fruit that is off limits, almost like a drug. So there's this old conflict, there's no communication, we do not know what happens beyond the mountains. And then main character, so there's this political system that she describes. There's a lot of exposition about the world and the politics and the law and stuff and this old conflict. And anyway, main character realizes from a young age, he hears a note and he knows that this note is dangerous. No one else hears it, and in this note he can sense, it's like a foreboding, I guess. And for the rest of his life he is afraid of this note because he knows that it is related to some dark magic. The story goes on. Basically, fairy fruit is being found in the city and we're trying to figure out how it's been smuggled in. A bunch of young girls at this like school for young girls, I suppose, who just one day drop everything and start climbing, like going towards the mountains and climbing over the mountains into fairyland. They disappear. And all this really interesting setup that then takes a bit of a break, becomes a murder mystery, like a cold case murder mystery that somehow relates to the fairy fruit thing. And it goes into detail about how like the judicial system in this world works, and there's a trial, there's several trials, and main character's son is placed somewhere to be safe. They don't really do anything. So yeah, it's a really interesting setup. Really interesting lore. It's unlike other fantasy of the time. So it was published before Lord of the Rings, and then every single fantasy for a really long time had to like measure up to the Lord of the Rings brand of fantasy. I'm sort of at a loss for words because I put it down and I was like, I'm not going to finish this, and then I had to know how it was going to finish. I thought that the second half did a lot of things, like the tension was lost to me, but the story and a lot of the elements of the story were really interesting, and I think it's a matter of like there's no precedent, not really, for Hope Mirrorless to, you know, work off of. Please tell me if you've read Blood in the Mist. What did you think about it? How did you interpret things? It sort of annoyed me how little the parents cared about their children, and I felt like women were very sort of infantilized. If you read it, what did you think about it? Let me know. Yeah, so next up was Midnight Library by Matt Haig, and I'm sure this is a book that you've seen elsewhere. Yeah, again, I think I found this through Lena Norms. Midnight Library is about a young woman. When we meet her, in the life where we meet her, she feels like a failure. She feels like there's nothing to live for. She's lost touch with friends. She used to have so much potential, and she wonders where all of that went. Yeah, so she is suicidal, and through a series of events gets the opportunity to go into this library, books that represent her potential other timelines. Every single thing she could potentially have done, any other life that she was sort of on track on living. And so she's like, well, what if I ended up with that guy? Or what if I pursued this or that? And she gets the opportunity through this library to try these lives out. And as you can imagine, learn things along the way that life, like the grass isn't always greener. Very interesting book. I read it at a time in my life a few months ago where I was going through similar, like it wasn't that dramatic. I was just having, is this too much to talk about on YouTube? You know, what should I have done? What shouldn't I have spent time on? And the main message was important, predictable, I guess, but that's life, I guess. I think it's something that I needed to read because a lot of the questions that she asks herself were questions that I asked myself. Anyway, I thought it was good to read in that headspace. I guess if you're a young person who's feeling lost, or if you're in your like late 20s going through your Saturn return, this is a good book. I felt like it was a little bit heavy-handed. It tries to be deep and also light at the same time. It's a very heavy topic. Themes of suicidal idealization and that kind of thing. And so in a way, yeah, I would definitely, I guess, put a trigger warning. But if it sounds interesting to you, I think most people could get something out of this. It was just very simplistic, I guess. It could have done with more nuance, considering the topic. After the Midnight Library, I got in touch with a friend who does not live in the same city as me, and we wanted to figure out a way to get in touch frequently. And I suggested a book duo. Essentially, there's two of us and we decide that we read the same book and then we discuss said book. And the first suggestion I had, knowing that she was a fan of Bridgerton, I had seen Reputation and I had found the audiobook. It's like Mean Girls set in Regency times. Main character going to her relatives for a summer, meeting cool girls, like a Regina George type person, and being introduced into sex and drugs and rock and roll, but in Regency times. I don't want to diss on chick lit because that's not the issue. I would happily rewatch Mean Girls or Legally Blonde or those kinds of early 2000s flicks, but when it comes to reading, I want something that is immersive and escapist. And I think I realized that, like, it's an interesting thing to consider, like, what was it like being a teenager and figuring yourself out in the Regency era? The Regency era also, due to Jane Austen, obviously, I feel like it's sort of romanticized. Societal rules and courtship and that whole thing. Unfortunately, I really struggled with this. I put it off, even listening to it. I'm doing my best to try and make this sound not like I hated it, but I think I did. So I will not be reading other books by Lex Croucher. I feel like maybe it was a little bit too much modern dialogue and anachronistic things. Like, I wondered why Regency. I understand why Regency, but I was still wondering, like, this is just romanticizing that era, but making it relatable to the kids. Next book. Okay, so next up on the list is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I decided to read this because last year I read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and I did really enjoy that. Sorry, I'm just staring into the abyss. So it's Daisy Jones and the Six is about a band in the 70s that had a huge hit album. It's written like a documentary. A journalist is interviewing members of the Six, and then Daisy Jones how the band came to be, what happened during their time. The Six is a band that has been on the rise when they are introduced to Daisy Jones, who is like a Hollywood socialite. She's grown up very independent and is sort of like a wild child 70s girl, and eventually collaborates. But what I liked about it is that, so because it's like a documentary style story and it's all these different perspectives, one-on-one interviews, so you get these funny things that feel really true to life. They remember different things. Someone says something happened in June, and then someone else says like we were finished in October. And like when they talk about how they came up with the name The Six, one of the characters like monologue, I guess, about how, oh well, I thought it was really cool and edgy and sort of like alludes to sex, you know, but we're the Six. So I felt like that was really rock and roll. And then cut to someone else in the band who's like, no, it was never a reference to sex. So those kind of little things happen, and obviously it's not just about Daisy Jones, even though she's sort of like one of the main characters. The typical thing of like the lead singer being the leader of the band, just the dynamic of the band, it felt both like a story you've heard a million times and still like a fresh take on 70s rock scene. I would recommend this book. I really liked it. Like I said, I preferred it to Evelyn Hugo, and I liked Evelyn Hugo. I thought that was an enjoyable book to read. So right, second to last book that I'm going to talk about today is Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Have mentioned before is I think it's the second ever Neil Gaiman book that I've read, is Coraline. I felt like Coraline was written children as an audience, whereas I did not have that feeling reading Ocean at the End of the Lane. It is an adult man looking back on a particular time in his childhood, so it is from the perspective of like a 7-year-old, but it felt very mature and dark, and I would probably have enjoyed it as a child, although I would have been terrified out of my mind reading it, but I think I would have enjoyed it, and it would have felt a little bit forbidden. You get the sense that it's a funeral, bringing him back to this old town. Saying any more is either going to be incomprehensible, like it would be too difficult to just give it like a brief outline. You're just going to have to read it. His parents trying to save money and renting out his bedroom, and that is the sort of catalyst for this magical, fantastical, and yet very dark and grounded story. I really liked it. It was unlike a lot of fantasy that I've read. It felt very much British author-y. Like it felt Terry Pratchett, Roald Dahl, that kind of children's story, but very dark. And I really like that. So it's really difficult to talk about without revealing too much or it sounding insane. So I'm gonna stop it right there. And we move on to the last book. Final book that I'm going to talk to you about today is Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes, a retelling of Medusa's story for a modern audience. I was interested in reading this book because Medusa's story is a story that I only learned about like 4 years ago. I found Mary Beard's book. She has an essay, I guess, called Women in Power, but I read that and absolutely fell in love with it. It talks about the view of women in relating to power, and she brings up Medusa's origin story, which this idea of Medusa as a villain, when actually she gets turned into a Gorgon as a punishment for being sexually assaulted in a temple. It's her fault, she gets punished, and then as a monster who turns people into stone, which isn't her own doing, Perseus is sent to kill her. I thought that was such a powerful like metaphor for the way that women still are viewed and vilified in media. Famous women, women with power. Wow, that's a really long-winded way of introducing this book, but it's humanizing these characters. It's telling not just the story of Medusa, but how her story is woven into the rich tapestry that is Greek mythology. So it's her story, it's the birth of Athena, and it's how Perseus is sort of recruited to take on the task of killing this monster and how the stories intertwine. You can't just tell Medusa's story without telling all the other stories because they are so linked. I thought the passages from Athena's perspective were a lot more interesting because she's such a stubborn and strong-willed character. It was very funny to read her like internal monologue and her talking with other characters from this pantheon of gods and demigods. There's one scene early on, her being the god of war, her witnessing a battle between gods and giants, which that was just a really cool fight scene. But yeah, so it has a lot of these other aspects of Greek mythology. If you're interested in that, I would recommend. There's a lot of characters, there's a lot of details. The book opens with like a list of gods and goddesses from Greek mythology so that you can refer back to it while reading, which some might love, but it's a lot to keep in your head. If you're not already interested in mythology, it might be a bit of a turn off. There's a lot of things that might go over your head. It definitely did for me. I'm not an expert on Greek mythology. What Natalie Haynes has done with the Medusa story is really impressive. Might not be for everyone. I did enjoy it. It was a bit slow-paced, and I think I prefer more medium to fast-paced stories. But that was it. That's what I've read this year so far. If you have read any of these books and have any thoughts, opinions, disagree with me, or if you have book recommendations based on these reads, then I would love to hear them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, wonderful weekend, and hopefully I'll see you back here soon. Take care.